You won't believe the audacity, the sheer, unadulterated gall. One sun-drenched Tuesday, the kind that usually promises tranquility, I found my 20-foot sailboat, the serene, sunk. Not just listing, not taking on water, sunk, deliberately, moored securely at my private dock on my private lake, its mast a pathetic periscope into the murky green, and standing there, arms crossed, a smug little smirk playing on her lips, was Carol Ann Higgins, or Karen Prime as my son Michael had aptly christened her, president of the Lakeview Harmony Homeowners Association, an entity I neither belonged to nor recognized, given that my property predated their entire pastel-colored, cookie-cutter subdivision by a good 70 years. Her justification, delivered with the righteous fury only the truly deluded can muster, your vessel was a clear violation, leaking pollutants into our shared community resource. Shared? I nearly choked. My grandfather dug this lake with his own 2 hands and a rented earth mover after the war. The serene, meticulously maintained, vintage but pristine, leaked nothing but nostalgia. The stakes were immediately, violently clear. My property, my peace, my grandfather's legacy, all violated by this self-appointed tyrant in a sensible beige pantsuit. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger towards the submerged boat. Consider this a final warning. Next, we'll have the county condemn this entire hazardous shoreline. She didn't know the survey maps were practically tattooed on the inside of my eyelids. She didn't know my family's legal firm had handled land disputes tougher than a $2 steak. She, in her boundless arrogance, had just scuttled a vessel of wood and sailcloth. What she'd truly done was awaken something she couldn't possibly comprehend. This wasn't just about a boat, it was about the sanctity of a boundary she'd so contemptuously crossed. She had just declared war, bellowing her terms across my water. She didn't realize I already possessed the maps, the deeds, and the will to redraw the entire battlefield, starting with the very ground her ridiculous little HOA office stood upon. The smirk on her face was an invoice, and I intended to make her pay, in full, with interest compounded by sheer disbelief. The sheer, unmitigated audacity was a marvel, a monument to the Dunning-Kruger effect, sculpted in suburban spite. Her little performance, framed by the gentle lapping of my lake against my shore, was so profoundly out of place it was almost art. Almost. The outrage wasn't hot. It was glacial, a slow-moving, immensely powerful force carving a new landscape in my mind. She prattled on about bylaws, community standards, ecological impact assessments she'd clearly printed off some free template website. I let her. Every word was another shovelful of dirt for the hole she was digging, not for me, but for her little empire of beige. The scene would have been comical if the core of it hadn't been so deeply offensive. My boat, a gift from my father, who'd learned to sail on it with his father, now a casualty of HOA overreach from an HOA I wasn't even part of. The violation was so profound, so personal, it bypassed anger and went straight to a cold, crystalline resolve. She thought she was laying down the law. She was merely providing the citation for her own downfall. Her parting shot, "You'll be hearing from our lawyers," was delivered with the gravitas of a warlord. I almost smiled. "Oh, I'm quite sure I will, Carol Ann," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "But I think you'll be hearing from mine first." Her smirk faltered, just for a millisecond. A tiny crack in the porcelain facade. Doubt. A beautiful little seed. I turned away, leaving her standing there. The conquering hero of a battle she hadn't realized was a carefully laid trap. The urgent need to see her brought down wasn't just a desire, it was a foregone conclusion. The game wasn't about if I would win, but how spectacularly she would lose. The tension wasn't in the outcome, but in the unfolding of the meticulously planned response she had just triggered. She thought she was the storm. She was about to meet the mountain. The first call wasn't to an salvage crew. It was to Arthur Jenkins, my family's legal counsel, a man whose mind was a steel trap lined with velvet, but a steel trap nonetheless. "Arthur," I said, watching the ripples spread from where the Serene had gone down, "we have a situation and an opportunity." The rage was a cold, blue flame, burning steadily beneath a surface of absolute calm. Carol Ann Higgins, in her infinite wisdom, had provided the casus belli. Now came the strategic dissection of her position, which, as I suspected, was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated hubris, and more tangibly, my land. My first act was to retrieve the high-resolution drone footage I routinely captured for property assessment, and, admittedly, for the sheer joy of watching the sunrise over my ancestral acres. The footage from that morning was gold. There she was, clear as day, directing two louts in a small john boat as they clumsily attached what looked like concrete blocks to the Serene's mooring lines, then systematically drilled holes just above the waterline. The pollution narrative was a laughable smokescreen. This was premeditated vandalism, criminal destruction of property. Michael, my tech-savvy son, home from college for the summer, reviewed the footage with a grim fascination. "Mom, this is insane. We can enhance their faces, get license plates if that John boat has one. She's certifiable." He was already typing furiously, his fingers a blur across the keyboard. "I'll cross-reference with local boat registrations, see if these guys are known associates, maybe disgruntled former HOA members she's roped in." His youthful indignation was a comfort, a reminder of the straightforward morality Carol Ann had discarded. My focus, however, was broader. "That's good, Michael. Get everything you can. But our primary target is the structural weakness of her entire operation." I pulled out the original plat maps, the ones drawn in India ink on linen, dating back to 1948 when my grandfather bought the land. I then overlaid them with the county's latest GIS data. There it was, stark and undeniable. The Lakeview Harmony OA Community Office and Recreational Facility, a rather grand title for a glorified double-wide trailer with a poorly constructed porch, sat unequivocally, brazenly, a good 50 feet inside my property line. They hadn't just trespassed to sink a boat. Their entire administrative heart was beating on stolen territory. Arthur Jenkins arrived later that day, his briefcase looking like it contained state secrets rather than legal pads. He reviewed the drone footage with a raised eyebrow, then pored over the maps with a small, satisfied hum. "Well, Eleanor," he said, his voice dry as a good martini, "it appears Mrs. Higgins has not only committed a felony regarding your rather lovely boat, but her entire organization is squatting. This simplifies things beautifully." His inner commentary, I knew, was far more colorful, likely involving terms like imbecile and godsend. We spent the afternoon crafting our opening salvo. No emotional outbursts, no indignant letters to the editor, just cold, hard, legal steel. First, a meticulously documented insurance claim for the Serene, including appraisals, restoration estimates, and a copy of the drone footage implicating Carol Ann. Second, a formal criminal complaint filed with the county sheriff, complete with sworn affidavits and digital evidence. Third, a cease and desist letter to Carol Ann personally, regarding any further harassment or trespass. And fourth, the pièce de résistance, a formal notice of trespass and demand for immediate removal of the HOA office structure from my property, citing chapter and verse of state property law, with a non-negotiable deadline of 30 days. Failure to comply would result in forcible removal and disposal of said structure, at the HOA's expense. Michael, listening in, let out a low whistle. "You're not just going after her, Mom. You're going after the whole hive. They made themselves a party to her actions by allowing her to operate this way," I stated, my gaze fixed on the offending structure visible from my study window. "They benefited from her tyranny. They can share in the consequences." Arthur smirked. "Poetic, Eleanor, and legally sound." The inner commentary was almost palpable. They built their flimsy empire on stolen ground. Time to collect the rent, with interest, payable in rubble and public humiliation. My deadpan wit was purely internal at this stage, a private amusement at the sheer, predictable idiocy unfolding. Carol Ann thought she was playing chess. She was actually a pawn in a game she didn't even know existed, a game whose rules were written in my favor, on maps she'd never bothered to consult. Her delusion was her greatest vulnerability, and I intended to exploit it with surgical precision. The calm before this storm was not an absence of activity, but a period of intense, focused preparation, the quiet winding of a powerful spring. The service of the documents was an event I orchestrated with quiet satisfaction. I opted against personal delivery. Too much drama, not enough clinical impact. Instead, a uniformed process server, a stoic ex-Marine named Henderson, whom Arthur kept on retainer for particularly robust deliveries, was dispatched. Henderson, bless his impassive soul, arrived at the HOA office during their regularly scheduled Tuesday evening community harmony meeting. I imagined the scene. Carol Ann, mid-pontification about lawn gnome height regulations, or the approved shades of beige for mailbox posts, interrupted by a figure who radiated more authority than her entire self-appointed board combined. Henderson, as instructed, served Carol Ann personally with the cease and desist and the criminal complaint notification. Then, with a theatricality I hadn't explicitly requested but deeply appreciated, he unrolled a large, laminated copy of the survey map, highlighting my property line in aggressive red, and taped it squarely to the front door of the double-wide. Finally, he handed her the eviction notice. According to Henderson's later debrief, delivered with the stoic satisfaction of a mission accomplished, Carol Ann's face went through a fascinating spectrum of colors, from indignant crimson to a rather fetching shade of puce. Her initial reaction, he reported, was pure, sputtering disbelief. "This is outrageous. An outrage. You can't do this. We are the Lakeview Harmony Homeowners Association. We have rights." Henderson, a man of few words, simply pointed to the eviction notice in her trembling hand. "Ma'am, the documents speak for themselves. I suggest you consult legal counsel. You have 30 days. His terse, cold delivery was perfect. He then served the HOA's rather bewildered-looking treasurer, a nervous man named Gary, with a copy of the eviction notice for the association itself. The ensuing cacophony, as relayed by Henderson with a flicker of something resembling amusement in his stony eyes, was apparently epic. Shouts, accusations, Carol Ann attempting to rally her troops, who now looked less like a disciplined legion and more like a startled flock of particularly dim sheep. My lawyer, Arthur, received a call from Carol Ann almost immediately. It was, he later recounted, less a conversation and more a tirade. She accused him of harassment, of colluding with a known troublemaker, me apparently, and threatened to have him disbarred. Arthur, who had faced down corporate raiders and actual mob lawyers, listened with the patience of a saint dealing with a particularly vexing toddler. His dialogue, as he recounted it, was a masterclass in terse, tactical deflation. "Carol Ann, this eviction notice is illegal. That office has been there for 10 years. It's HOA property." Arthur, calmly. "Miss Higgins, I refer you to the official county survey plat, a copy of which is now adorning your front door. The structure in question is situated approximately 53 feet, that's 5'3", inside my client's undisputed property line. Your occupancy constitutes trespass. The 10-year period you mentioned merely establishes a decade of uninterrupted illegal encroachment, not a right. Carol Ann, we will fight this. We have lawyers, good lawyers." Arthur, a dry chuckle. "I sincerely hope so, Mrs. Higgins. They will need to be. My client is also pursuing full damages for the criminal destruction of her sailboat, an act for which we have compelling video evidence identifying you as the primary instigator." A pregnant pause. Then, according to Arthur, a distinct gulp. The power dynamic, so skewed in Carol Ann's mind just hours before, was recalibrating with the brutal efficiency of a market correction. I watched from my window as the emergency HOA board meeting convened on their illegally occupied porch, illuminated by the harsh glare of a single, flickering fluorescent tube. The juxtaposition of their frantic gesticulations against the serene backdrop of my moonlit lake was almost painfully ironic. They were trapped, and they were only just beginning to realize the bars of their cage were not bylaws, but legally binding property lines, My inner monologue was a quiet hum of satisfaction. Read the documents, Carol Ann. Read the survey map, especially the part where your little clubhouse, your seat of imaginary power, is sitting squarely on the land my grandfather bled for. Tick-tock. The legal action was the initial barrage. The moral revelation would come with the dawn, and the relentless ticking of that 30-day clock. The HOA hysteria was, frankly, spectacular. Carol Ann, clearly unaccustomed to her authority being questioned, let alone legally demolished, went into overdrive. Suddenly, my perfectly manicured lawn, untouched by their ridiculous regulations for years, became a hotbed of alleged violations. I received a flurry of notices, slipped under my gate with theatrical stealth, presumably by Carol Ann herself, under cover of darkness. My ancient oak tree, the one that had shaded my family for generations, was suddenly a hazard to community power lines, which were, amusingly, buried on the other side of the street, nowhere near my property. The color of my front door, a tasteful heritage blue, was deemed out of compliance with aesthetic guidelines that had never, not once, been presented to me, because again, I was not in their HOA. It was all so predictable, so petty. Michael, my tech-savvy sidekick in this suburban skirmish, had set up discreet, motion-activated cameras covering my property perimeter after the boat incident. We now had a delightful collection of footage. Carol Ann, looking like a budget spy in a trench coat several sizes too large, meticulously measuring the height of my rose bushes at 3 a.m. Carol Ann attempting to stick a violation notice onto my gate with what appeared to be chewing gum, Carol Ann shaking her fist at my security cameras when she finally noticed one. It was a goldmine of escalating harassment, each clip carefully archived and time-stamped, forwarded to Arthur with a brief, deadpan note. Exhibit D, E, F, and so on. She's quite prolific. My inner monologue became a running commentary on her rapidly deteriorating grasp of reality. She genuinely believes these little paper darts have power here. It's like watching a child try to command the tide with a plastic bucket. I, of course, ignored the notices. They were legally meaningless, a desperate flurry of blows from a flailing opponent. Instead, I focused on fortifying my position, both legally and literally. Arthur was preparing for any frivolous lawsuits Carol Ann's good lawyers, if they even existed beyond her imagination, might attempt. On the physical front, I had a sturdy, temporary chain-link fence erected along the precise property line, separating my land from the HOA's actual domain, running right up to the edge of their illegally situated office. The section of fence directly in front of the office trailer had a large, professionally printed sign, "Private property, no trespassing. Structure scheduled for removal. By order of my name, legal owner." The visual metaphor was potent. Their flimsy headquarters now visibly cordoned off, an island of illegality within my rightful domain. My family was my anchor. My husband, Tom, usually a man of quiet amusement, was now grimly supportive. "She picked the wrong fight, Ellie," he'd said, watching the fence go up. "This isn't just about land. It's about principle." Michael, in between cataloging Carol Ann's nocturnal escapades, was already designing a new, even better mooring system for the replacement boat we'd eventually get. "This time, it'll have underwater cameras," he declared, "and maybe a small, contained EMP device for unauthorized approaches." I chuckled, but the protective loyalty underpinning his humor was a balm. The neighbors, the silent majority, watched these developments with a mixture of apprehension and, I suspected, covert glee. A few brave souls offered quiet words of support when they thought Carol Ann wasn't looking. "She's gone too far this time," one whispered over the back fence. "We've all been putting up with her nonsense for years." They were rebellion fodder, waiting for a clear sign that the queen was truly toppled. Carol Ann's strategy, if one could call it that, was to increase the pressure, hoping I'd crack. She'd underestimated my foundations. Every petty notice, every late-night foray, was meticulously documented. Another nail she hammered into her own coffin. Another paragraph in the story of her downfall. My cold, calculated vengeance was simply allowing her enough rope. The legal noose was already in place. She was just tightening it with her own frantic, ill-advised actions. The tactical ops metaphor wasn't far off. This was a siege, and her castle was built on sand, or more accurately, my soil. The 30-day countdown on the eviction notice became the metronome for Carol Ann's escalating desperation. Each tick of the clock seemed to amplify her irrationality. The HOA, or rather Carol Ann, did indeed attempt a legal maneuver. Arthur received a hastily drafted, typo-ridden motion for a temporary restraining order to halt the eviction, filed by a local lawyer whose primary practice appeared to be slip-and-fall cases and uncontested divorces. The argument was a masterpiece of legal incoherence, claiming adverse possession, despite the office being a movable trailer and not occupied for the statutory period under any legitimate claim of right, community hardship, as if the entire subdivision would collapse without their beige double-wide command center, and my personal favorite, emotional distress to Carol Ann, caused by my aggressive and unwarranted legal tactics. Arthur, with the predatory calm of a shark sensing blood, eviscerated their motion in a response so concise and legally unassailable that the judge dismissed their request without even requiring a hearing. Arthur's email to me was brief. Frivolous attempt neutralized. Their counsel appears to be out of his depth. Proceed as planned. The inner monologue from Arthur was practically audible. Amateur hour. Did they pull this lawyer out of a cereal box? Carol Ann, however, remained defiant. The HOA office continued to be occupied. She held increasingly strident emergency planning sessions on the porch, now a daily occurrence. From my study, I could hear her amplified voice. She'd acquired a cheap megaphone, railing against tyrannical landowners and enemies of community harmony. It was performance art of the absurd. My dry wit surfaced in my notes to Michael. Subject Ka, now employing acoustic warfare. Low grade. Ineffective. Suggest earplugs for any further surveillance. He texted back. Noise, canceling headphones acquired. Also, popcorn. The spectacle was drawing more attention. Neighbors, initially hesitant, were now more openly observing the drama. The illegally parked cars for her rallies were starting to annoy the actual residents of Lakeview Harmony. Cracks were appearing in her support base. One afternoon, Gary, the nervous treasurer, approached my fence timidly. Mrs. Anderson, he stammered, clutching a sheaf of HOA financial statements that looked suspiciously disorganized. Is there any way to negotiate this? Some of us are worried about the legal fees and, well, everything. I regarded him coolly. Gary, the time for negotiation passed when Mrs. Higgins authorized the sinking of my boat and continued to illegally occupy my land after being duly notified. The eviction stands. The deadline is firm. He swallowed hard, eyes darting towards the HOA office as if Carol Ann might materialize and smite him. She's not listening to reason, he muttered, more to himself than to me. She says we have squatters' rights. That's a profound misunderstanding of property law, Gary, I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. I suggest you and the other concerned members consult your own independent legal counsel. Quickly, he scurried away, a rat deserting a sinking ship, or in this case, a soon-to-be demolished trailer. My internal commentary was less charitable. She was squatting, but with such conviction, almost admirable if it weren't so profoundly stupid and legally untenable. The final week arrived. I finalized arrangements with a local demolition contractor, a gruff but efficient man named Mac. Office trailer on private property, fully permitted eviction. Everything above board? He'd asked, eyeing the site. Everything documented, court verified, sheriff notified. I confirmed. He grinned. My favorite kind of job. Clean and decisive. The bulldozer was scheduled for the morning after the deadline expired. Day, as Michael now called it, was imminent. Carol Ann continued her megaphone diplomacy, blissfully unaware that the earth-moving equipment was already being prepped. The cold, calculated vengeance was reaching its crescendo, a symphony of her own making, conducted by the precise, weaponized narration of the law. The preparations for day were imbued with a somber resilience. This wasn't a celebration, but a necessary, if grim, restoration of order. The night before, I walked the perimeter of my land, the crunch of gravel under my boots, the only sound in the cool autumn air. The lake, my lake, was a sheet of silver under the harvest moon. This property wasn't just dirt and water. It was a repository of memories, a testament to my grandfather's pioneering spirit. He'd carved this sanctuary out of wilderness, not for an HOA to defile, but for his family to cherish. The sinking of the Serene wasn't just property damage, it was an attack on that legacy, a desecration. My protective loyalty was a fierce, quiet burn. That was the moral revelation, the core of my unyielding stance. You do not mess with a family's sacred ground. You do not mistake quiet ownership for weakness. Carol Ann had made that fundamental, fatal error. My inner monologue was a quiet conversation with my grandfather. They thought it was just a patch of grass, a convenient spot for their little clubhouse. They didn't understand it was rooted in bone and belief. The next morning, as the sun began to paint the sky, I made the courtesy call to Sheriff Brody. He was a man of few words, weary of suburban squabbles but a staunch defender of property rights. "Sheriff," I said, my voice calm, "just a heads up. The 30-day eviction notice for the HOA structure on my property at 1420 Old Mill Road expires today at 9 a.m. Demolition is scheduled for 9:30 a.m. All legal paperwork, court orders, and service confirmations are on file with your office and my attorney, Arthur Jenkins." A grunt from his end. "You expecting trouble, Eleanor?" "I expect Mrs. Higgins to be theatrical," I replied. "My attorney will be present. I'm merely requesting a patrol car be available in the vicinity to ensure public order and prevent any breach of the peace. This is a lawful action on private property." "All right, Eleanor," he sighed. "Just keep it clean. I'll have a unit swing by." His reluctant authority figure role was crucial. His presence would legitimize the action in the eyes of any bewildered onlookers and deter Carol Ann from truly dangerous escalation. Reluctant, but he knew the law was on my side. Michael was practically vibrating with anticipation. "This is going to be epic, Mom. Truly epic. Can I film it for my sociology project?" "From a safe distance, Michael," I said, a rare smile touching my lips. "And strictly for academic purposes, of course." He grinned. "Of course." The contractor, Mac, arrived with his crew and a gleaming yellow bulldozer on a flatbed trailer precisely at 9:15 a.m. The machine, even parked, exuded an air of implacable power. It was a visual metaphor for the unstoppable force of consequence. Arthur pulled up shortly after, his expression one of professional solemnity, though I detected a glint of battle readiness in his eyes. He handed me a fresh copy of the final eviction order, stamped by the court. "All set, Eleanor?" "All set, Arthur." My voice was steady, betraying none of the cold, calculated fury that had been simmering for a month. It wasn't about fury anymore. It was about closure. It was about justice, delivered not with a gavel, but with a diesel engine and a very large blade. The moral cost of inaction would have been far greater than the effort of this reclamation. This wasn't just revenge. It was the reassertion of a fundamental right, a boundary drawn in steel and law. The arrival of the bulldozer was the overture. Its diesel rumble cut through the morning quiet, a guttural announcement that the charade was over. Carol Ann and a handful of her most devoted acolytes were already there, clustered on the porch of their condemned office like shipwrecked sailors, clinging to a piece of flotsam. Their expressions shifted from defiant indignation to slack-jawed disbelief as the massive yellow machine was unloaded. Carol Ann, clutching her megaphone as if it were a scepter, was the first to find her voice, a shrill squawk of outrage. "What is the meaning of this? You can't do this. This is HOA property. We have rights," she advanced, a small, furious figure against the backdrop of impending demolition. I stepped forward, holding the court-stamped eviction order. My voice, though unamplified, carried with a clarity that sliced through her histrionics. "Mrs. Higgins, The meaning of this is that your 30 days are up. You are trespassing. This structure," I gestured to the double wide, "is on my private property. It is scheduled for immediate removal, as per the legal notices you have received and ignored." Arthur flanked me, a silent but imposing presence. "Ma'am," he interjected, his tone glacial, "the eviction is lawful and court-sanctioned. Any attempt to interfere with this process will constitute obstruction, and we will not hesitate to involve law enforcement for your immediate arrest." Just then, as if on cue, Sheriff Brody's patrol car cruised slowly into view, parking discreetly across the street. The visual cue was not lost on Carol Ann's remaining supporters. 2 of them began to edge away from the porch, muttering about needing to be elsewhere. Her meltdown was spectacular. She shrieked about injustice, about the destruction of community, about her years of thankless service. She accused me of being a bully, a land-grabbing monster. It was a torrent of impotent rage. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion and the sight of the bulldozer, were gathering along the street, a silent audience. Some filmed on their phones, their faces a mixture of shock, curiosity, and, in a few telling cases, thinly veiled satisfaction. The silent majority was no longer entirely silent. Their presence was a verdict in itself. I ignored Carol Ann's tirade. I turned to Mac, the contractor. "Is your crew ready?" He nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Ready when you are, ma'am." I then addressed Carol Ann one last time, my voice devoid of emotion. "You were given ample opportunity to remove your personal effects and any property belonging to the Lakeview Harmony Homeowners Association. You have precisely 5 minutes, starting now, to remove anything you wish to salvage from that trailer. After that, it, and everything remaining within it, becomes demolition debris." Her face contorted. "This is vandalism. Theft." "No, Mrs. Higgins," Arthur corrected smoothly. "This is the lawful execution of an eviction order on abandoned property subsequent to your failure to comply. The choice to leave items behind is entirely yours." The tactical precision was beautiful. She was trapped by her own inaction. The 5 minutes ticked by, filled with her increasingly desperate, incoherent protests. She made no move to enter the trailer. Her remaining cronies looked at each other, then at the bulldozer, then back at Carol Ann's apoplectic face. One by one, they melted away, leaving her utterly alone on the porch of her crumbling little kingdom. The public embarrassment was acute, a harsh spotlight on her powerlessness. The clock ran out. "Time's up, Mrs. Higgins," I stated. I nodded to Mac. He climbed into the cab of the bulldozer. The engine roared to life. The first impact of the bulldozer's blade against the flimsy underpinning of the HOA office porch was a dull, satisfying thud. Wood splintered, vinyl siding buckled. Carol Ann let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a strangled sob. She lunged forward, as if to physically stop the multi-ton machine with her own small frame. Sheriff Brody, who'd been observing with a stoic patience that I suspected was costing him dearly, finally intervened. He and his deputy moved swiftly, intercepting her before she could endanger herself. "Ma'am," Brody said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you need to step away. This is a lawful action. Don't make this worse for yourself." She struggled briefly, then seemed to deflate, tears of rage and frustration streaming down her face, as the deputies gently but firmly escorted her to the edge of my property, well away from the demolition zone. She stood there, a pathetic figure, watching her tiny empire crumble. I watched, my expression unreadable, a cold, resolute calm, masking the righteous fury that had fueled this entire operation. Each crunch of wood, each shatter of glass from the cheap windows, each groan of tortured metal as the bulldozer bit into the structure was a note in a symphony of consequences. It wasn't gleeful. It was necessary. It was the physical manifestation of a boundary reasserted, of an injustice rectified. My inner monologue was a quiet reflection on the journey to this moment. All this, over a boat, or, rather, over her perceived absolute right to dictate reality to others, irrespective of law or common decency. She built this monument to her ego on my land, and now my land was reclaiming it. The trailer, not built for permanence or resistance, folded with surprising speed. The walls collapsed inwards, the roof sagged, and then caved with a whoosh of trapped air and dust. Mac handled the bulldozer with an almost artistic precision, nudging and pulling, collapsing the structure systematically into a manageable pile of debris. The visual metaphor was stark and unavoidable. The flimsy office, symbol of Carol Ann's overweening authority, reduced to a heap of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered illusions. The neighbors watched in stunned silence. Phones were still recording, capturing every moment of the HOA's demise. I saw a few discreet smiles, a couple of nods exchanged. The silent majority was witnessing the public dismantling of a local tyrant, and the air, even thick with dust, seemed somehow lighter. Michael, filming from a discreet vantage point, gave me a subtle thumbs up. Arthur stood beside me, a silent sentinel of legal rectitude. "Efficient," he commented, his tone neutral, but I caught the faintest hint of satisfaction in his eyes. Within 30 minutes, the Lakeview Harmony HOA Community Office and Recreational Facility was no more. All that remained was a flattened patch of dirt and a sizable pile of rubbish, soon to be hauled away to the county landfill. The bulldozer idled, its work done. The quiet that descended was profound, broken only by Carol Ann's distant, muffled sobs. The moral violation of sinking my boat had been met with a tactical retaliation so complete, so public, that there could be no mistaking the message. The reckoning had been delivered, not by a committee or a vote, but by the unyielding assertion of one individual's rights against the encroachment of petty despotism. The air smelled of broken wood and something akin to liberation. The dust began to settle, both literally and figuratively. Mac's crew, with swift efficiency, loaded the debris of the former HOA office into dump trucks. By early afternoon, the patch of my land where Carol Ann's ersatz throne room had stood was scraped clean, ready to be reseeded with grass. To blend back into the peaceful landscape it should never have been separated from. The visual metaphor of the cleared earth was one of a fresh start, a cleansing. Legally, the fallout for Carol Ann and what remained of the Lakeview Harmony HOA was just beginning. Arthur initiated proceedings to recover the full costs of the Serene's salvage and repair, plus punitive damages for the malicious destruction of property. The video evidence, coupled with Carol Ann's increasingly erratic behavior, made our case exceptionally strong. The HOA itself, now headless and homeless, faced not only my claims but also the internal chaos of its own making. Gary, the erstwhile treasurer, contacted Arthur a few days later, his voice a quaver of panic. "Mrs. Higgins has drained the HOA accounts," he stammered. "She said it was for legal defense, but the lawyer she hired. He says he was only paid a small retainer and has now withdrawn due to irreconcilable differences and non-payment." It seemed Carol Ann's good lawyers were as ephemeral as her grasp on reality. My inner commentary was a dry, shocking, absolutely shocking. The local news picked up the story naturally. HOA office demolished in property line dispute, read one headline, accompanied by a rather dramatic photo of the bulldozer mid-crunch. On-screen text visuals in my mind played out, Karen Prime defeated, tyranny toppled by tractor. The narrative, even in the somewhat sensationalized media coverage, was clear. Property owner stands ground against overreaching HOA. Carol Ann's social ruin in the neighborhood was complete. The mystique of her authority, once potent enough to make grown men meticulously measure their lawn height, had evaporated with the first impact of the bulldozer. She became a local cautionary tale, the crazy HOA lady who got her office knocked down. I heard whispers of her attempting to rally support, to form a new concerned citizens group. But the well of neighborhood tolerance had run dry. People crossed the street to avoid her. My family and I began the process of healing. The Serene was salvaged, a more extensive and costly process than initially anticipated due to the deliberate nature of the sinking. The restorers, old craftsmen who understood the soul of wooden boats, were meticulous. "She'll sail again, Mrs. Anderson." "Mr. Henderson," the chief shipwright assured me, his gnarled hands gentle on the damaged hull. "Better than before." The cost wasn't just financial. It was the emotional toll of the violation, the weeks of strategic battle, the necessary hardening of resolve. Peace, I reflected, was not a passive state but an actively defended territory. My porch light, switched on each evening, felt like a beacon of restored control. The new fence, now a permanent and aesthetically pleasing structure tracing the true boundary, was more than just wood and wire. It was a psychological closure, a definitive statement. Michael was already planning the launch party for the restored Serene. "We'll call it the Unsinkable 2, he declared. I smiled. The resilience was inherited. The cold, calculated vengeance had given way to a somber satisfaction, the quiet pride of having weathered a storm and reclaimed what was rightfully mine. The lock on my gate clicked shut each night with a sound of profound finality. The blood, metaphorical in this case, but representing the moral cost of her actions and my response, had been accounted for. The neighborhood, in the weeks and months that followed, found a new equilibrium. Without Carol Ann's iron-fisted and often misguided rule, a sense of cautious liberation spread through Lakeview Harmony. Some residents, those who had chafed most under her reign, actually thanked me, discreetly of course. "You did what we all wished we had the courage to do," one neighbor confessed during a chance encounter at the grocery store. I learned that a new, far more reasonable HOA board was eventually elected, one focused on actual community upkeep rather than draconian enforcement of imaginary bylaws. Their first act was to formally apologize to me for the previous administration's unfortunate actions, and to disavow any claim or responsibility for Carol Ann's debts or legal woes. Arthur handled the correspondence with his usual brisk efficiency. My life returned to its former tranquility, but with a subtle difference. The lake seemed bluer, the air cleaner, the quiet more profound. The patch of land where the offending office had stood was now a lush stretch of green, indistinguishable from the rest of my sprawling lawn. It was as if the earth itself had exhaled, cleansed of the blight. The Serene, beautifully restored, once again graced my private dock. Her sails, crisp and white, billowed in the autumn breeze, a testament to resilience. Sailing her on the lake, my lake, was a quiet joy, a reclamation of peace. My final reflection on the whole sordid affair centered on the peculiar nature of petty power. Give some people an inch of authority, a title, a clipboard, and they'll try to build an empire, often on ground that doesn't belong to them, governed by rules they invent on the fly. Carol Ann was a case study in such delusion. She believed her self-importance translated into actual power, her pronouncements into law. She learned, the hard way, about the unyielding reality of property deeds, survey maps, and the quiet determination of a reluctant warrior pushed too far. The tactical justice fantasy had played out in stark reality. My military-like planning, my lawyer as a strategic asset, the precise execution of the eviction and demolition, it had been a campaign, fought not with weapons of war, but with the equally potent arsenal of the law, wielded with cold, calculated precision. There was a somber satisfaction in the outcome. No joy in another's complete ruin, but a profound relief in the restoration of order, in the affirmation that boundaries, both physical and ethical, matter. The intense personal toll had been significant, but the alternative, allowing such a transgression to stand, was unthinkable. So yes, that's how I ended up bulldozing an HOA office that was illegally squatting on my land after its president. A woman whose ego far outstripped her sense decided to sink my sailboat because she felt like it. You wouldn't believe the paperwork, the sheer mind-numbing volume of legal filings and affidavits, but the quiet now, the undisturbed view of my lake, the absence of shrill pronouncements from a megaphone, the knowledge that justice, however laboriously achieved, had been served, priceless. My grandfather would have approved, I think. He always said, "Defend your land, Eleanor. It's the only thing they're not making any more of." And sometimes, defending it requires more than just a sturdy fence. Sometimes, it requires a very clear demonstration of where the line is drawn, and the consequences for those who dare to cross it with malicious intent. The first-person retaliation opera had reached its final satisfying cadence. The curtain had fallen on Carol Ann's reign of error.